Cool. I think we can get started. We got a nice number of people signed up. So hello everybody. Welcome to the webinar. My name's Hugh Fordham. I'm the CEO at Hollaroo. I have my co-presenters Ben Jackson from Cogency and Nick Cole from Dentons. Ben, do you want to introduce yourself just quickly?
Sure, yeah. So Ben Jackson. So I run a consultancy which focuses on candidate experience, so very relevant to today, and also employee experience through the use of HR and recruitment technology.
Nick?
Yep, good afternoon everybody. My name is Nicholas Cole, or Nick. I am the Head of Resourcing at Dentons. For those who don't know, Dentons is a global law firm, in fact the largest law firm currently in the world by headcount. I'm accountable for all recruitment across the UK. That encompasses early careers and experienced hires. And one of the things that we pay critical attention to is candidate experience at all levels. So obviously very keen to have this discussion during this current period of time.
So I've tried to get together a blend of different approaches. So obviously our side on the Hollaroo side is on the technology side. Ben is the expert on candidate experience, and then Nick can give the perspective of a business user. So hopefully that'll give you a nice rounded picture about what we're talking about. The main focus of today is going to be all built around a discussion on the issues which have been raised by the attendees. So when you registered for the webinar, you had the chance to raise, one of the challenges that you were facing as in this current situation. So we saw such a big response to that we thought there's no point in us talking to you guys just about the things that are interesting to us. We want to build it all around what's interesting to you. So the main focus of today is going to be that group discussion. Before that, we just wanted to run through quickly a few practical tips which I think might be useful in the current context. So I'm going to talk a bit about dealing with personal stress. Then Ben is going to talk very quickly about candidate experience, but in the context of the stress that people are under. I'm going to talk about a few quick practical suggestions, and then, as I say, the main focus of today is going to be talking about the issues which are being raised by the people attending the webinar, and seeing whether we can build those into themes and some good ideas about how we can meet those challenges. So if we start with the dealing with personal stress, and one of the things that really jumped out at me from the responses is, we're all struggling with the current situation, and we're all dealing with uncertainty, and we're all having to manage a situation which is changing by the day, and that's difficult. And I suppose one of the main things I wanted to get out of today is just recognize that we are all in the same boat. Everybody is struggling with it. Everybody is finding the current situation challenging. So at a personal level, you're not alone. Everybody is having the same experiences as you. And when I was talking to Nick and Ben about today, we thought at some stage it could turn into a nice group therapy session for everybody. One of the things just on that, you may be aware of research into the potentially negative impacts of social media and how that impacts on the ways people are feeling. And one of the things about that is recognizing that what you see on social media, what you see people posting, is not a true reflection of reality. So in our particular context, looking on LinkedIn, seeing people posting up happy messages about what a brilliant job they've done of moving everything online and onboarding 500 people in 2 minutes. Everybody is shouting about their success, and that can give you the impression that everybody's doing an absolutely fantastic job, and maybe you're not. That's absolutely not the case. We are all facing challenges, so you are not alone. And then the second bit about stress, which is a technique that I find quite useful, and it's really simple, is just focusing on your breathing. So there's a technique called box breathing, which is, there's all sorts of different versions, but the really simple one, which I think was developed by the Navy SEALs, was the idea that you breathe in for 4 seconds, hold your breath for 4 seconds, and then breathe out for 4 seconds. And if you do that for a few minutes, it not only helps you calm down and get a control of your breathing, but also because you're focusing on your breathing, it tends to take your mind off, you know, some of the things which are stressing you. So I think it's a really good technique, and it's very simple. If you want something a little bit more technical, there's an app which you can get on any phone called Breathe by Dr. Judd. It's the same sort of process where you tap on something and then you breathe in as the app's talking to you. So that's a sort of slightly more technical version of it. But yes, very simple, focusing on your breathing, doing control breathing when you're at that point where you're feeling slightly overwhelmed is very useful. So that's dealing with stress. So I'm now going to hand over to Ben to talk about candidate experience, which I think also talks about stress, but maybe more about its impact on people and what they can do.
Absolutely, thanks Hugh. So I guess really I wanted to focus a little bit on the kind of the psychological impact of what everyone's going through at the moment. It is incredibly difficult times for everyone, as we all know. And I think stress, fear of the future and fear of the unknown, fear of uncertainty, and also frustration are completely universal. Everyone's feeling that at the moment. We can't do what we've always been used to doing. And of course, we're worried about our own health, the health of our loved ones as well. And of course, around the economy. So it's just about the most uncertain time. And in kind of preparation for this, I read some really interesting articles linking the impact of uncertainty on what's known as affective behaviour. So, when you're in a situation where there is uncertainty, it actually makes your reactions to situations much stronger. Interestingly, that can be a positive thing or a negative thing. And they talked about gambling being one of the kind of the positive psychological impacts of uncertainty, because gambling obviously is about uncertainty, but people enjoy it. The flip side of that is when it's uncertainty about a negative potential thing, you start to think more about the negative outcomes that could potentially happen, even becoming potentially obsessed about them, and so on. And in this time, let's face it, it's a time when the worst could happen. You might lose somebody. You may be worried about relatives or friends. You might be worried about losing your job, or you may have lost your job. And again, looking at social media and things like that, I've seen some incredibly positive stories and also some negative stories. Some people who've been made redundant have gone and found a job working in the supply chain, for example, but other ones who are struggling, and it's grim. There's also thinking about candidates. There's been a number of cases where employers, through no fault of their own, have had to rescind offers. So that also increases stress. Or you've been given an offer, but you can't actually start because of either the employer isn't set up from a kind of virtual perspective to start you, or the nature of the role, or whatever. And even though that might not be as bad a situation as some of the other ones I've just mentioned, still incredibly stressful, because it adds again to that uncertainty that people are feeling. And the last point here, and I probably have expressed this a little bit clumsily, but there's also a point where we've seen a lot of employers over the last few weeks who've really stepped up to the plate and have done some amazing stuff, some really positive stuff, which has seen so many people talk about the pride that they feel for their organisations. There's also a lot of people who are working for organisations where maybe they're starting to realise actually they're not that great. And the behaviours that an organisation demonstrates in a period like this are very often indicative of the culture of the organisation and the culture of the people at the top. And if the organisation you work for hasn't done what you feel are the right things by the employees, by the customers, and so on at this time, you're probably also thinking, well, hang on a minute, I'm feeling a bit trapped in an organisation I don't necessarily want to work for, that doesn't align to my values, and so on. So that's also another point to bear in mind. So what does this mean for candidates? Well, obviously job searching has taken on a new level of urgency that it hasn't seen for a long time. We've been in a pretty buoyant job market. Employment levels, there was a report I think yesterday or today around employment levels pre-COVID, and we were at record levels of employment. And now all of a sudden we've got this situation. So for those people who are out of work, there's a much greater degree of urgency to find something while there are still things available. And employment itself has become much more precious. I set up Cogency back in October, and you know, of spending many years of kind of looking at the monthly paycheck and thinking, I'm sure there's a way of kind of doing more than this. And now I'd absolutely kill for a monthly paycheck. It would be absolutely wonderful to have that security coming in. And I think people really feel that, and really feel that they want to keep hold of something that at the moment is one of those anchors that people have psychologically to a more kind of secure and stable life. So stability and security are absolute priorities. And this final point is a really, really critical one. Trust is absolutely the key currency at the moment. And we've seen it again, referring to my previous slide, where organisations maybe haven't done the right things. We're seeing some interesting kind of backlash, for example, around Virgin Atlantic at the moment, some of the things that have gone on there, rightly or wrongly, fairly or unfairly. But trust is a really, really important point. And in periods of huge uncertainty, people are looking for an authentic position in every dealing that they have with people, because actually it gives them some sense of integrity, it gives them some sense of assurance that things are going to be okay. So how can we as an industry help? Well, fairly obviously communication is the key thing. And this is where we're doing a lot of work at the moment with people to help them to understand how they can find and implement and use communication tools, not only generally, but also for the specific audiences. And I mentioned there are people who maybe have been offered a role but can't start. We've got talent pools that you've spent you know, months potentially developing, that you want to keep in touch with, even if you can't necessarily offer roles. You've got your employees who might be working remotely for the first time, etc., etc. So it's a complex thing, and it's not necessarily going to be solved just by saying, well, let's use Zoom or whatever. One of the other things I think is really important is clarifying your position as an organisation. And again, in preparation for this, we had a bit of a discussion about this, and I think it was Nick who said, you know, not knowing is fine though. And I think that's absolutely right, because you need a position, you need to be able to communicate something clearly to people, but sometimes none of us know. And I think we can be honest and we can be authentic about saying that actually we don't know, but managing expectations in terms of next communications, managing the message around what we're doing in this situation and so on, I think is incredibly powerful for people. I think there's definitely something which links very neatly with employer brand, actually, which is around how you celebrate the way that you and your organisation has acted to make things better for employees, for candidates, for society as a whole. And crucially, promise only what you know you can achieve. So there's no point at the moment going out with a message that, you know, we're going to come back to you with a clear position in 2 weeks on exactly what's going to happen with your offer or your role or whatever it might be, if you're literally not in a position to be able to do that. So let's make sure that we manage that messaging. Messaging is really, 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 really key. And there's this sense of mutual empathy that I think is really important. So, you know, we need to create a situation where we're being empathetic with the people that we're talking to, but also we help them to be empathetic to the situation that we're in as recruitment professionals, HR professionals, because it's difficult for us too. And on a human level, we're going through the same things that they're going through. On a professional level, you know, I was talking to a client of mine the other day who's spent literally the last week and a half, moving their entire workforce of about 17,500 people to online working from office working. Just a horrendous task, and ultimately successful, but has been incredibly painful. So I'm not saying that we should make people feel sorry for us, but we need to make it clear that actually we're all in this together, which I know is a bit of a cliche, but I think it's a really important thing to say now. And then the final point really from me is, is technology the answer? Well, yes, I think to an extent it is, but let's remember that technology is an enabler. So it can do lots, but it can't do everything. You have to engage with technology. You've got to set it up right. And it's only by providing the right content and the right engagement that you'll actually make it really work for you. I think some of the key opportunities really around engagement platforms, which I think we'll talk about a little bit more later on. Most people use some degree of online assessment at the moment, but I think we're seeing a rapid increase in the number of organisations who are adopting virtual assessment centres and things like that very quickly. And I think we just need to be a little bit careful with the speed that we adopt this and the quality of the tools that we're using to make sure that we don't lose sight of things like, for example, diversity and inclusion, assessment, rigour and methodologies, consistency, all that kind of good stuff. CRM, I mean, my God, CRM is so important at the moment, particularly for talent pools where we've been investing heavily in trying to get those talent pools created, and now that talent pool might be on hold for a while. So how do we engage with them? How do we communicate our positive messages from an employer brand perspective to them during this time? Virtual internships, I find this absolutely fascinating, and it's probably long overdue. There's a lot of change happening now very quickly around this, but absolutely, why do people need to necessarily be in the office for these things? Of course, it's better in some respects because they get a higher sense of the environment they're going to work on and so on. But why can't we keep going with these internships? Why can't we keep moving them just because we haven't got the opportunity to bring them into the offices? And again, if you think about that talent pipeline for grads and apprentices and so on, 1, 2, 3 years down the line, if we don't do this now, we're going to find ourselves with a big skill shortage in a few years' time. By the same token, virtual inductions, new employee integration. So how do we get people who are starting with us but are going to be working remotely? How do we make them feel part of the team, part of the organisation? There's some great tools out there to help with that. And then, of course, once they have joined, how do we help them learn in a really kind of interactive and positive way? So anyway, lots of opportunities. I think we need to always be careful that tech is an enabler rather than kind of the solution. But anyway, that's my kind of assessment of the situation at the moment.
No silver bullets. Everyone's always looking for a silver bullet.
Oh, sorry, I forgot one more slide. So in terms of what the future will hold, we will absolutely bounce back. And I think everyone's confident about that. We'll bounce back, but it's just when. I think consumers and employees will determine which businesses or employers responded to the crisis in the right way. So think really super carefully about your employer brand at the moment, and the good stuff, again, like I said before, celebrating the good stuff that you're doing. I think the final point is just the changes that you make now. I think there's quite a lot of short-term thinking, and a lot of these changes will actually turn into BAU as we move forward. So make sure that the changes that you're making in terms of collaboration tools or whatever are the right ones, because you might suddenly find actually in 3-6 months when all this is hopefully becoming resolved, that actually they've become the norm, and you don't want to find yourself with the wrong tech, the wrong solution, the wrong process at that point. And now I am done.
Cool. So one of the things about people operating under stress is the way your brain works is you tend not to be able to think about complex ideas. So I wanted to keep this as simple as possible and just offer 3 practical steps for what organizations can do right now and the sorts of things they might want to think about. The switch to virtual, which Ben's already touched on, the idea that we've now got time and you need to have a space to manage that time, and then the last point, which is about embracing slowness, which I'll get to. On the virtual interaction, one of the things I've always thought is that recruiting is very much like dating, And so I was very interested to see there's a post up there, the URLs there, basically some advice on how to do a date over Zoom. And I was reading it and I was thinking, there's so much of this that could be really useful, and it's really good advice for if you're doing interviewing over video or what have you. And lots of the ideas, because it's a bit fun, and we'll see later on when we talk about the challenges, I think you've also got to think about your hiring managers in this context as well, and they're probably feeling quite awkward about doing interviews in an online environment. So using this as a basis for giving them some guidance, I think would be quite good. The points I picked out is that when you're doing stuff online, one of the things you need to get out of the habit of is looking elsewhere whilst the conversation's going on. You know, you need to be very, very focused on the person you're talking to, and again, probably simplify the messaging and get it very, very clear about what you're trying to achieve over the call. Recognizing the fact that it's not normal. I think it's absolutely fine to say to people, look, you know, we're all a bit struggling with the situation, and you know, getting that up front rather than pretending that this is normal. Being realistic about the limitations of the online platforms and the fact that there's all sorts of nuances and things which you won't get over a virtual platform. So being realistic about that. Don't just take your current offline process, turn it online, and think you can do exactly the same thing. The more positive way to look at that, which is about the flexibility side, is you can be much more creative about your process. So, for example, it's no hassle for somebody to jump on a Zoom call. Whereas if you're trying to get them to travel halfway across the country to your office, you know, you need to make sure that you get everything done when they're there. So it's entirely possible to split up what you would be trying to do in an interview or in an assessment day or whatever into lots and lots of smaller pieces, and be much more flexible about the process. So there's things you can do by going online that are much more interesting than just taking an offline process and making it online. The point about space to wait is we're all in a situation where lots of things will be either on hold or will take much longer than normal. And the first point about that is don't feel awkward about talking about that to your candidates. Everybody knows the situation. It's not like a situation where a particular industry was struggling or a particular organization was struggling, and so the fact that they were going into a hiring freeze or having to slow stuff like that down or what have you was a negative point. These days, the fact that people are slowing down and having to change plans on a daily basis is entirely normal. So being upfront about it, recognizing that this is now an open-ended thing. So going back to some of the points that Ben was making about you can't make firm commitments. You have to recognize that we're in a situation where things will be changing on a day-to-day basis. You're setting up an open-ended relationship, but because you've got the time and the space, use that time to do productive things. So our whole approach at Hollaroo is that the relationship with the candidate is as much about them learning about you as you learning about them. So now you've got more time for them to do that, and especially as people are approaching the end of the selection process, why not give them access to more materials, more learning, so that they're even more informed and ready to go once things pick up again. And then our final point, which is again one of our core principles, is put the candidates in control. Think of the candidates. They are under great stress. They are feeling quite often that they have no idea what's going on, and they feel in the classic black hole of feeling as though nobody's talking to them. So if you give them the tools that let them take a bit more control over what's going on and when they can interact, that's hugely powerful for them. And this is just an example. We worked with a number of our clients about just creating waiting spaces. So basically all candidates who are being disrupted by the process at any stage, or who might be interested but you've got nothing to offer them at the moment, just have a space where you can put them to keep them warm and engaged. And then the final point was about embracing slowness. And again, I was listening to another podcast about the current situation and the psychological impacts and the ways to handle it. And one of the things that came up was just recognize that everything is going to happen more slowly now. And again, take the positives out of that. And actually the suggestion that came out of it was that people should get back to writing letters, because you could take the time to compose a message and then walk down and post it in the postbox or whatever. It's going back to another age of communication. I'm not suggesting that we should go back to writing letters to our candidates, but I do think we can be comfortable about dialing back the intensity of our communications. You know, there's no point. This is a marathon, not a sprint. There's no point in having frantic, chats and video calls and conversations with people all now, and then running out of energy and dropping it all off. You need to be recognizing this. We could be in this for the long haul. So turn it back into a slightly more gentle way of communicating with people, nudging them. I think again, one of the points that Ben made was being supportive, offering advice, again recognizing that we're all in the same boat and both sides of the equation need support and advice, and use the time to build relationships, which is both from the point of view of the organization, but also if we're now starting to talk about people who are coming into your organization but will be moving straight into a remote working context. Obviously, one of the challenges there is all of the things you do typically in your first week in an organization. That's sort of an intensive relationship building period where you're getting to know people and you start to build those relationships that are going to help you through your career. Obviously, that's much more tricky in an online context, and for all their benefits, online tools, video calls or what have you, can't replicate a lot of the underlying aspects that you get from a physical meeting. So what I would say is that you can still build relationships online. It takes a bit more time. So starting that relationship building process as early as possible will help your candidates move into the organization much more easily. So those are my 3 tips. So like I say, I wanted the bulk of today to be about the challenges which have been raised by the group as part of the registration process for the webinar. We've also got the chat open in the webinar. So if people think of new things as we're talking over some of these topics, feel free to add comments, add questions, and we'll try and add them into the conversation. I've divided them up into topics, and one topic I just put in was there are lots of things which people raise which are the sorts of things that people raise all the time about dealing with niche markets, dealing with senior people, young people, hard to find talent, and then this whole idea of keeping them warm over a long period of time, whether that be over your selection process or whether it be over the onboarding. So Ben and Nick, I don't know which one of you want to start. Is there anything about the current situation that you feel has made some of these challenges more pointed?
Nick, do you want to say that one?
Yeah, I will actually. I just want to go back to your point around embracing or welcoming people into the organisation, actually, Hugh, because that initially was one of the challenges that we were quite concerned about. How are we going to induct somebody from their front room or from their bedroom or from wherever they're sitting on a Zoom type platform? And actually, we've turned that into a real positive, because that's given us time to reflect on our current induction program. I think there was a little bit of complacency with the previous program, in that because we're all in the same building, we could just say to candidate A or new joiner A, go and see Joe Bloggs, who's on level 2, and he'll tell you all about what he does, or go and see Sue on level 3, etc., etc. Whereas now, obviously, we can't do that. So certainly one of the things that we've turned into a positive in that respect is we've made our induction process a lot more robust and a lot more considered, considering that these individuals have got no kind of immediate support around them. So just, I suppose, in terms of keeping in touch and engaging, we've really involved the whole firm now to be as part of this induction program, whereas before it was just our HR team, which was fine. It worked well. We could, as I say, people to where we need to be. But it's little things like that that it's made us think a little bit more broadly and be a bit more acutely aware of how we communicate and engage at that point of introduction. And I think that will also open the door to more ways of thinking in terms of how we engage with our employees at all levels and at all periods of their tenure with us.
Ben, any thoughts on just the overall challenges on candidate experience and anything particularly pointed?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd kind of pick two of these. I think the first one is a really poignant one, and there's lots of concern at the moment about the young people who are coming out of university and school into potentially a really challenging job market. And certainly I know personally some people whose kids are going through this situation, and that's really hard. And I think we've got to, fortunately, most of the organisations that we work with who recruit graduates and school leavers are still progressing with their programs at the moment, which I think is fantastic. But we have seen some reduction in the numbers, which is a bit of a shame. But I think this is something where, if we look back to the last recession and then go back even further to the kind of dot-com bust in kind of 2001, lots of people stopped their programs and then found that actually they found it very hard to get going again at the point at which they wanted to. So I think from the point of view of kind of employer brand, from the point of view of actually business necessity, if you want to continue with that pipeline of young people, then you shouldn't be stopping now recruiting them. And through things like the virtual internships, there's no reason why you can't be providing great work experiences and great insights into your roles for people, even without meeting them in person. So that's the first one. And the second one, really quickly, I think is just about the kind of points 3 and 4 on this slide. How you potentially utilize all the technology that's available to you now to create a really good platform for engaging people, keeping them stimulated, and, as I said before, kind of communicating the good stuff that you're doing as an organisation, so that they get a real sense of the fact that actually this is an organisation that they want to work for. And I think if you simply switched off that communication during this period, there'll be plenty of other organisations who are very grateful for that, and we'll be having those conversations with those candidates over this time. So, yeah, I think that's the other one I'd pick out.
Cool. The next point, which is quite interesting, is there's been huge amounts of focus on organisations stopping, organisations freezing, organisations having to rescind hires, and what sometimes we lose track of is that actually there are a load of organisations out there that are desperately hiring, and either they may even be accelerating their hiring, and the issues that they've been raising are because of the current situation. People are very reticent about moving, and somebody raised a point about how am I going to persuade somebody to relocate halfway across the country in the current climate. So dealing with the fact that people are uncertain about moving, dealing with if you want to be proactive, is it insensitive to go out to candidates and offer them new opportunities in the current context? And then we've already talked a little bit about diversity, but somebody raised the issue of if even more of the process is going online, if even more of the process is becoming virtual, does that have a risk of adding in barriers to potential diversity groups? So I don't know if anybody got any thoughts on that.
Just from my perspective, Hugh, we've fallen into the camp of slowing down recruitment quite considerably, except for certain pockets that remain fairly busy. As I'm sure most people on the call would appreciate, within the legal sector, some areas will be heavily disadvantaged, while others obviously will be incredibly busy. So our recruitment is kind of aligned to both of those camps. And I'm pleased to say that those that are in the process of onboarding remain engaged. And I think that comes down to continuous and honest communication throughout. What we've opted to do is put in weekly calls with those that still are working notice periods to encourage them and also to provide them with updates, going back to Ben's point, with regards to where the firm currently stands and the activities that it's sort of seeing through during this certain period. And that will include aspects like furloughing and looking at safeguarding other roles across the firm. So we've actually found it not to be too much of a trouble, I suppose, still getting candidates engaged and wanting to join the firm, because, you know, as I say, we have tried to provide them with as much information as possible to give them as much comfort as possible that they are still joining a firm that will safeguard their future, and there is plenty for them to be doing.
Any thoughts, Ben?
Yeah, I think it's interesting hearing what you're saying there, Nick, about kind of people being still open to receiving an approach. And that kind of second bullet point around the insensitivity, I just, as long as the call or the email or whatever it is handled well, I really don't see that should be an issue. You know, we're in a market where people are nervous about their employment. Obviously, the government's furlough scheme might have taken away some of that pressure and tension for some people, but I think everyone's kind of aware that times are going to be tough. And if you've got a really good employer contacting you saying, look, actually, we've got some really good opportunities, and they can back that up with a really positive message about what they're doing and how they're behaving, I don't see why that would seem insensitive. I think there's there are ways and means of doing it, but yeah, absolutely, why not? And I think to the point around kind of fewer CVs on the market, in any situation like this, there's going to be a sense within the market that maybe the opportunities are more limited, and therefore people will take their foot off the gas from the point of view of looking for work. But again, as Nick's example showed, I think if it's a good employer with a good approach, and you're looking for people, I'm sure there are people out there that you'll be able to find. The D&I piece, I think, has been mentioned a couple of times. I would like to kind of focus on that a little bit. We've seen, this entire crisis is affecting BAME people more than anyone, and that's something that we need to understand a lot better. But my only concern really at the moment about that is just to make sure that when we're putting processes that have previously been either face-to-face or over the phone or whatever it might be, when we're putting processes online, we just don't lose sight of people from diverse backgrounds, and we make sure that the same level of rigor, the same level of consistency, and dare I say it, the same level of kind of quality control or policing, if I can call it that, is adhered to. Because if we move very quickly into a different way of doing things, some of that good work that we've been really focused on for the last kind of 10, 15 years might get lost in translation to a different way of delivering the process. So that's just another kind of point that I'd like to raise at the moment.
One of the things we talk about in this context is the fear of rejection, and the fact that given if your first interaction with an organisation is applying for a job, and especially in the current context where there are maybe fewer jobs out there, and almost by definition, most of that experience will be negative in the sense of most people get rejected. What that then leads into is something called learned helplessness. So basically, people stop bothering to apply, and I think that's one of the things that's quite significant in impacting on diversity, because certain types of people or certain groups of people are affected by this more. So you may be, if that's the only experience people have when they're interacting with you, that may be starting to put some diversity barriers in place. So it's one of the things to think about.
Definitely.
Next, lots of things raised about, you know, managing under stress, people having to do the same with reduced resources because their team's been reduced, having to, you know, because of that, having to focus on particular roles rather than the whole experience, and they're wanting to deliver a high touch experience, but they can't. And then lots of people talking about stress and unprecedented and psychology around the current situation and keeping people involved and engaged. Anything else about dealing with stress we can talk about?
Well, I think the only thing I'd just kind of reiterate here is going back to the kind of the technology piece. With the first couple of points on here is how do you leverage the technology either that you've got, how do you make it work better for you, or how do you bring in technology that's actually going to help you to manage this? I'm not underestimating how hard this is for everyone, and you know, we were already in a situation where most HR and recruitment teams were pretty stretched, and we're working with relatively limited kind of budgets and limited resources. So to then suddenly find yourselves in a situation where you've got to manage all of this on top of the day job is a huge challenge for people. But how you can bring in technology to make that easier, I think this is a prime opportunity to really look at what you can do to reduce the kind of the administrative burden, etc., on the team. I think we've talked about the kind of stress thing and how you can reduce that in terms of some, you know, practical things, mindfulness, and so on. But fundamentally, one of the things that I think we are seeing, which is incredibly, you know, profoundly positive actually on a human level, is there is a sense that we are, to an extent at least, as a kind of a society and as a group of people, coming together a little bit more to look after each other, and that can only be a good thing as well. So I think a bit of understanding around how you create better process efficiency, how you leverage technology at this time, and also how we all look after each other, you know, that'll have a massive positive effect.
And I think
Yeah.
Go on, Nick.
Sorry, Hugh. No, I was just going to follow that up, really, Ben, by saying what we've done internally is really taking it back to basics and keeping things simple. You know, prior to this all happening, we had a very heavy workload. We had a number of deadlines and projects that were all super duper important and had to be done by yesterday. But now that we have got a reduced team, it's really allowed us to kind of just take a step back. I think it was what you were saying earlier, Hugh, about really dialing back and working smart and working within your capabilities. Because I know a couple of individuals within my team, you know, they're very kind of driven and focused on achieving their goals. But it's just a case of just, again, getting us to relax, appreciate that we've got, you know, not as much resource available to us at this moment in time. You mentioned budgets as well, Hugh, of course. I'm sure the majority of people on this call will be affected by that in some shape or form. So it's just a case of just everyone just taking a deep breath, reprioritising what needs to be done to ensure that what service we are providing is at the best of our ability, and that does come down to keeping everyone informed throughout the process, just to make them aware of where we are, what we can do, and how they can help us, and vice versa. And that seems to be working okay for us just now.
I think just talking about it from a technology perspective, you know, in times of stress, the other thing that people tend to lean towards is the need for human touch and human contact. And if you're dealing with you know, reduced resources, you know, one of the things you need to think about is how do I, with reduced resources, still either maintain or increase that human touch with my candidates. So augmenting the human side of recruitment rather than totally replacing human touch with automatic tools. Disruption. So basically dealing with the fact that things are changing all the time, not knowing, you know, what you're going to need next week from the point of view of candidates or having roles available, dealing with longer processes, capturing people's interest when you've got nothing to, well, I would say you've got lots to talk about, but in the traditional recruitment context, the mindset that if we haven't got any jobs and there's nothing to talk about is there, and it's something I would challenge. And I think that last point about people being concerned that if they can't be confident, if they can't give people definite dates, if they can't say, yeah, you're definitely joining us on this date, they feel nervous about saying anything and worried that if they say something that isn't definite and isn't positive, it's going to affect the reputation of the organisation. And I'll go back to what I was saying about the fact that everybody's in the same boat. It's not, I emphatically don't believe that you just being open and honest about the disruption that's happening with your business, with your candidates, is going to have a negative impact on the reputation. I don't know if you'd agree, Nick, from your perspective. Oh, Nick's frozen. Are you there, Ben?
Sorry, Hugh, can you still hear me?
Yes, I can, but you've frozen.
This is the power of technology, obviously. So my screen's just frozen. Apologies. But no, I think you're quite right, Hugh. I think I going back to what Ben was saying actually around, even if you haven't got an honest or an answer, it's being honest about that. And certainly the confidence that I've been getting from Dentons and from senior leadership is that whilst no one knows what's going to happen tomorrow, this is completely unknown to everybody, they've been very open and transparent in terms of what they're thinking and what the next steps potentially would look like, and are communicating that back to the whole firm, which, as we were discussing the other day, whilst we haven't been given specific comms by the communications team, the feedback that we're getting via the internal channels gives us confidence to speak to candidates externally, because we feel comfortable with what's happening, even though we're not too sure on what the direction is going to be in 3 weeks' time as it is compared to now. So whilst, again, so I'm just repeating myself here slightly, but going back to what Ben was saying, it's okay not to know, but as long as you're keeping that constant communication, I think it's really important.
And I'd just add to that, I was just thinking, kind of, if you go back 6-8 weeks, so before all this really kind of starts kicking off, I went to a number of kind of events where we were talking about ghosting and the problem of ghosting within the kind of the recruitment world. And candidates who have applied for literally dozens of jobs, if not hundreds of jobs, and never heard anything back from any of them. It's really interesting. Nobody's talking about that at the moment. Everyone's talking about how do we communicate, and that I really hope is a positive out of this. That all of us as human beings have been through this process where we can't see people, we can't go down the pub, we can't go to a restaurant and see friends anymore. There's this sudden sense that we've all really got to communicate, and I think if that drives any positive change around the kind of the ghosting that's been happening, that will be a massive long-term benefit of this. And so much of what we've been talking about today, so many of the kind of the points that people have been saying when they've raised these kind of questions have actually fundamentally been about that human interaction, that contact, how do we communicate with people and so on. And Nick, obviously, with the work that he's been doing with Dentons, clearly so much of that is around how do we engage with people, how do we communicate with them. And I think my ideal outcome for all of this is that ghosting becomes effectively outlawed within the kind of the HR and recruitment community, because I think we've all got this sense as people that all of a sudden, my God, when the ability to communicate face to face has been taken away from us, we've suddenly felt that kind of that sense of loss around communication. So I really hope that drives some positive behaviours moving forward.
That's a really good point. And in a couple of slides' time, people are there are some people using the time to innovate, and I think that's going to be one of the key points is how can we actually deliver a good candidate experience. Transition to virtual is a struggle that lots of people are having. So how to do it, how to sell the organization online, how to do about virtual interviewing, virtual training, virtual onboarding. One of the things I thought was quite interesting is a couple of people brought up challenges dealing with the hiring managers. So literally hiring managers saying, we're just not going to do any interviewing online, or just the fact that it was having to be handed off with everybody working remotely was just introducing more and more delays into the process. I've sort of touched on it a bit of saying, let's start to help the hiring managers and help them overcome those psychological burdens, because I think if they are imagining they can get back to face-to-face interviewing next week, it's just not going to happen. I don't know if you've got any thoughts, Ben. Not sure if Nick's still with us. You still there, Nick?
Yeah, no, I'm still here.
Okay.
Just can't see you. Sorry.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, the hiring managers are always an interesting population, aren't they? And I think every business has challenges with some of them. But I think we're in a situation now where they don't really have a choice. And if they want to keep the pipeline going, and if they're serious about recruiting the people, then they're going to have to do something. For me, they just need to get on board. There's obviously some great video interview technology, and we've been banging on about that for many years, but there's some great technologies that can help with that and can help to maintain the consistency of the experience and the consistency of the assessment. So absolutely, if you don't already use those things, then use them. I think the hiring community. It's funny, isn't it? We're talking about candidate experience today, but actually, the experience of the hiring managers is intrinsically linked to that. And actually, they're a population who are going through all of the stress and the pain and the uncertainty that our candidates are going through as well. So, we need to make sure that as best as we can, we kind of put our arms around them, and we help them to understand that there's a way of continuing to manage a process and continuing to keep it moving that maybe they don't like, but if we can provide them support to demonstrate how successful it can be and how actually we can kind of look after them through that process, then maybe we'll affect that change as well. So I think they're a population that we sometimes love to hate, but actually they're human beings as well, and we need to look after them too.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Ben. And I think the one thing that really resonated with me of what you just said there was the support aspect. Certainly, there are quite a number of people within my firm, for example, that really do want to see that individual face to face. They don't feel they get the right experience or get the right feel for an individual through a screen. So what we're doing is actually providing them either with some training to be equipping them with the right questions to ask, or actually joining them on that meeting. So that's been helpful. In some instances, we've conducted the meeting and we've got it to a point where we're keen, we're interested, but they still want to meet face to face, and that's actually from the candidates' benefits as well as our own. Yeah. So it's just sort of prolonging the process per se. But again, that's with the agreement of the candidate, which is fine. It's a workaround, I suppose, because the process is still moving in some respects. And where it's also been kind of implemented for us is on the induction, as I was mentioning earlier. That seems to be working pretty well. And as I say, in fact, we probably have sort of introduced a more robust process now than we've ever had, quite frankly. So there's been a huge benefit on that side.
We've got a couple of more topics. I'm conscious of time. For people who've got a hard stop at 3, basically, I think we're going to get a video of the webinar, so we'll be able to send that out so you can catch up with the last bits. For anybody else who's able to stay on, it's probably another 10 minutes or so. So the next topics which were raised is how to keep in touch with people when you're putting roles on hold, the candidates left in limbo, which goes back to Ben's point about ghosting, the ability to give regular updates to keep the candidates warm, make them feel supported, make them feel reassured. I'd obviously say the solution is Hollaroo, but leaving aside the technology, Ben and Nick, any other thoughts on that particular topic?
I think we've probably covered a lot of it, to be honest with you, Hugh. I think you know, communication's been the key theme throughout this, and how, you know, potentially technology can help you with that, but also, you know, just to the last bullet point on this, how you make sure that candidates feel supported and reassured, I think really comes down to, you know, the messaging, the information about what your organisation is doing and how it's behaving in a difficult time, and also that honesty and that authenticity. So, you know, if you don't have a specific piece of information to give them, but you can, you know, give them something that helps to reassure them, then by all means do that. But I think fundamentally that's it for me.
Yeah, I'd agree, Ben. And the other thing from us is responsiveness. Just making sure that any ad hoc emails that are coming through. So we've got a generic email account that anyone can sort of put queries through to, and we're just making sure that we're responding back to any kind of speculative applications, agencies that are coming through, or anyone, quite frankly, just to make them aware of where we are, so that they're not left in limbo. So it just just aids, it lets them know where they are, where we are, I suppose.
Then the final topic, which Ben's already touched on, is one of the things that I'm hoping is that now that people maybe have got over the disruption and the transition into a new way of working, they've started to get some processes in place and they're starting to get on top of things, maybe people now have the time to take a breath and think about all of those things which they've known have been really important in the past, but just haven't had time to think about. And some of these topics came up, you know, genuinely taking the time to think about candidate experience, think about the ghosting point that Ben made, think about when you start a conversation with your candidates, how you support them through the process, how you bring them into the organisation. I think if you do have time, there's an awful lot of really interesting technology, really interesting thought around ways of doing things and processes out there. So take the time to educate yourself and start to learn about what's possible.
I'd agree with that. I think the only point I would make on that is just bear in mind what I said earlier, that the changes you're making now, of course, it's not going to remain like this forever, and people, you know, this idea that everyone's going to be working virtually for, you know, the rest of time, you know, that's overstating it. But the fact is, the changes you're making now are very, very likely to have a lot more longevity than the crisis that we're going through. So, you know, it's just about making sure that, you know, the innovations that you're being forced to make, I guess, by the situation, are innovations that can live longer and that will continue to provide value to your business, your clients, your hiring managers, after this is all over.
I guess also on that point, Ben, is don't think that just because we need to think innovatively because we're in this, you know, this virtual world, I suppose, is that you need to try and onboard every new piece of technology going. So from our own experience, we've tried Slack, we've tried Trello, we've tried Zoom, we've tried this, we've tried that, and we've fallen back. I think we've appreciated actually the technology we've currently got is perfectly fine. So I think it's just appreciate what you've got before you start running out there and spending more money on other bits and pieces.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and just, I mean, you know, going back to my ATS days, you know, the technology is often not the problem. The issue is with how people use the technologies and how they're set up. So, you know, something as simple as have a look at your ATS and understand the candidate journey and seeing whether maybe you could take the time to tweak some of that.
Absolutely.
Why not?
Yeah, definitely.
Cool, that was great, and hopefully everybody found it useful. Just a couple of topics on how to follow up. There's a fantastic event next week called Talent Tech Rising, which is quite fun because it's going on through the whole week next week, but it's very useful to dip in and out of, and you can, you know, I think they're covering just about every single subject under the sun, but just being able to just turn up virtually and watch a couple of 10-minute demos or 10-minute presentations, I think could be quite a good way to spend some of next week. And we've got a video in there, so if you want to learn more about Hollaroo, that's one way of doing it. apart from that, my contact details are here. So if anything's come up that looked interesting, or if anybody's got other questions or things which weren't raised and they want to get in touch with either myself or Ben, whose details are up there as well, feel free to get in touch. I really hope that was useful. Want to re-emphasize the point that we're all in this. Everybody's struggling with the same challenges. So you're not alone. You're one of many, and we're all, I'm sure you can reach out to pretty much anybody who will be more than happy to help you. Anything else from you, Ben or Nick?
No, just to say thank you, and thanks everyone for joining. It's been great.
Yeah, likewise, echo that.
Thanks very much, everyone.